Last week, ExOk Games put on an Earthblade Q&A livestream. I sat through the whole thing and diligently took notes, so if you missed it, I'm going to be going through all the questions that people submitted and their answers. I'm just going to have the game's trailer on a loop in the background, so feel free to open another tab and do something else while you listen. Questions will also be up on the screen. First question is, what games would you say are the biggest influence on Earthblade's map and world design? So in general, they said that there was no one game that had the biggest influence on Earthblade. Someone said that Breath of the Wild was kind of just generally like a turning point in video games and world design, so that's definitely something they leaned on a little bit. They also mentioned Dark Souls, of course, because what game is not inspired by that one? The last thing they said was Skytorn, which was one of their old prototypes that they never ended up finishing. So they're kind of taking some of their ideas from that and reworking it into a new game with a bigger team and a bigger scope. Next is, will the game have a focus on movement options such as dashes like Celeste and Towerfall? So the movement is definitely not on the same level as Celeste. There will be different movement options that you can unlock as you kind of progress in the game, and moving around will be fun, but it's not going to be hardcore. Is Earthblade a Metroidvania? So this is a question that they said that they've gotten a lot. And it's definitely inspired by the Metroidvania genre, but they don't want to call it that because they don't want to put a limit on themselves and on their game. In the end, Earthblade just doesn't fit into the description of Metroidvania 100%, so they just don't want to call it that. How many buttons are there and how are they mapped? So Celeste had a very minimal amount of buttons. I think it was just like you moved, jumped, and then dashed. This is not going to be like that. Someone said it was going to be somewhat along the lines of a Link to the Past, where you equip different things to different buttons. Also, something interesting, it does use the right stick on the controller, but they can't say why, but apparently it's pretty cool. They hinted at that a little bit later, that it was something kind of unique and interesting, so we'll have to find out. Earthblade's also not going to necessarily be the best game to play with keyboard and mouse. It's definitely designed with controllers in mind first, and while you can play it with the keyboard, it's just not, I guess, as intuitive as with a controller. Why was the release date pushed to 2024? So the development of Earthblade started just a few weeks before COVID, so obviously that's very bad timing. This is also the first game that ExOk has made completely from scratch. They mentioned that their other releases either started from game jam projects or just from team members' side projects that they already had like something there as a base. So this process, creating it from scratch, is definitely slower, and there were a lot of things to kind of learn during that. So there's a lot of reasons that it's coming out in 2024, but it looks pretty cool, so I don't really care. How long did it take to finalize the concept of this game versus Celeste? So Celeste was a very quick game to make. They said it took 2 years, and there weren't any kind of like outside factors influencing that, like pandemics, people having kids, and people immigrating. And the game was also just pretty simple in general. You're just climbing a mountain. They didn't really do any prototyping. They just jumped into it and started creating levels. Earthblade is obviously very different from that, and this is their 4th prototype of the game, so, who knows what it looked like in the beginning stages, but they finally landed on something that they thought was worth pursuing. And speaking of that, what directions did you explore but not decide to pursue? So one of their earlier, versions of this game, or one of their earlier ideas, was something along the lines of a procedural, top-down, physics-based roguelike set in space. It was also it had 3D graphics, but still 2D gameplay, so there was just a lot of new things going on that the team didn't really have experience making yet. Basically, it was too far outside their comfort zone for them to even know what the next steps were. What are the names and pronouns of the characters? I'm really glad someone asked this because I was also wondering what their names were. So the main character we already knew was called Nevoa, and she has she/her pronouns. And the name actually means mist in Portuguese. 3 of the people in the live stream are from Brazil, so there's a lot of Portuguese and Brazilian influence in the game, and just little references here and there. Next is this green-haired character. Their name is Kato, I think. Kato as in avocado. They didn't write this one out, but Kato uses they/them pronouns. And then the person with the horns is named Oliver, and he's a musician, and he plays an electric lute, which is in the soundtrack. So he's actually playing part of the soundtrack, which is really cool. Next question, is the game grindy or more chill? So no, the game is not really grindy. It's not like Celeste, where you kind of have to, grind to build up your platforming skills and kind of replay levels over and over. And it's also not grindy like an RPG is, where you have to reach a certain level in order to fight a boss or equip something or whatever. Earthblade does have character growth and progression, but again, it's not grindy. Will the game have couch co-op? No, it will not. What effect will seamlessness have on the gameplay and immersion? So the word seamlessness is something that the team has talked about a lot when they're describing this game. And this is kind of the question that they talked the most about, so it's pretty important. The seamlessness really kind of affects everything in the game, all the different systems. So in the world itself, there's no loading screens, which is also shown off in the trailer. And there also aren't really any hard walls between areas. They kind of just blend into the next. The trailer was not a trick, as they said. It was the actual map, and it was shot in the game world. Something else that is seamless is the music. They went pretty in depth with this, but I'm going to try my best to summarize it. In open world games, there tends to be less music all the time compared to games like Celeste, where it's just like, okay, this is the level and this is the music that plays in the level. And one of the reasons for this is because in an open world game, you don't really know what the player is going to do next. In a game like Celeste, when you get to a certain part of a level, then maybe the music changes and the gameplay gets harder, so the music gets faster. But in an open world, you don't know what's going to happen. So in order to create music that fits with any player's experience, it has to account for basically all the different things that the player could do. Earthblade will have a kind of adaptive or dynamic music system, and they do get very technical when describing this. Like, for example, in the swampy area, there is like an invisible radius in this zone. So as you get closer to the middle of the circle, then the music kind of develops. And then as you're leaving, it gets more minimal and then kind of transitions into wherever the next area you're going is. And then for the art and the backgrounds, there's a big focus on transitions. One of the other reasons that the game is taking longer than Celeste is because they are creating their own tools in the game engine in order to kind of have everyone be able to work directly in the game. For example, Amora, who does the character portrait and the kind of high-res non-pixelated art, is able to use their custom editor to add her portraits into the game, which she wouldn't have been able to do before since she wasn't a programmer. So she kind of would have had to send it to someone and they would have to add it. But their new tools allow everyone to work on the game in their own department, so they can all kind of collaborate in real time rather than just pass stuff back and forth. Okay, next is, will the game have difficulty levels that affect achievements or endings? They're not quite sure on this one yet. Earthblade will have as many accessibility options as possible, but they're not sure that this is gonna necessarily affect achievements or endings. My guess is that it'll be similar to how accessibility worked in Celeste, where you can kind of just turn different things on and off, but overall, you'll still have the same experience as someone who doesn't use any of these options. How long is the game compared to Celeste? So right now they don't really know how long the game is. They're not necessarily aiming for a certain amount of time. They just want the game to be as long as it needs to be. What will speedrunning be like in Earthblade? The game is not specifically designed around speedrunning, but they will be having speedrunners in mind, and it'll probably have sequence breaking. But yeah, basically just speedrunning a non-linear game where you'll have to use glitches instead of pure skill. Is the game more linear or non-linear? Definitely non-linear, but they're not sure to what degree. Some parts of it obviously need to be more linear because they'll be following a story, but the story is the least developed part of the game right now, so it's kind of up in the air. Will Earthblade have Brazilian Portuguese? Yes, it will. As I mentioned, a third of the development team is from Brazil, so they will absolutely have Brazilian Portuguese. And localization to them in general is very important. They can't say, what all the languages that they'll have on release will be yet, but they're going to have as many languages as possible. What lessons have you learned from creating Celeste? One of the main things was their custom editor and making sure that it accommodates everyone on the team, even if you don't have any programming experience. They also said a bit about QA and that they had, I think, just one person that was mostly doing the QA testing. So they're definitely going to do this in a different and more efficient way this time. Next is the prop system. Now with their new editor, they have it set up that you can just be playing in the game, pause it, take a screenshot, draw something on top of it, and then put that just directly in the game. So this allows for a lot of custom props and objects to be easily put into the game rather than just kind of reusing the same asset over and over just because it's easy. Next question is, what platforms will Earthblade be on? They're not ready to answer that question yet. On Steam, you have to pick at least one PC platform, so they just chose Windows because they 100,000% know the game will be on Windows. They're definitely gonna try their best to have it release on Linux and probably the major consoles. Now, what does the title mean? They couldn't say the answer to this question either, but they did say that's like answering what the title Celeste means. The game is called Celeste because it's about Celeste, and so Earthblade is called Earthblade because it's about Earthblade. I don't know. My theory is that Nevoa's sword is called the Earthblade. That just makes the most sense to me, but maybe it's something more in-depth. I'm not sure. Is there equipment and inventory management? Yes, you definitely have some degree of freedom when mapping different abilities to different buttons. And then they also hinted at there being a little bit more to it than that, but they didn't really go in depth. And I think they said something about the right stick. So we don't know what the right stick does, but it does something cool. Who knows? The last question was, will there be animated cutscenes? Probably not, but I guess it's possible. It really depends how the story plays out. It also comes down to Amora, who is the non-pixel artist, not being able to do all that animation work on her own, especially since she's already doing all the character portraits, and the portraits are somewhat animated already. But they did note that most of the cutscenes would be in-game. It's more like in Celeste where you're playing and then you get to the end of the level, you get to a certain part, and then you kind of just have a text box that comes up on the screen while the characters are there and they do their thing, and then you get back into the game. So that was my summary of the Earthblade Q&A. I did my best to explain everything that they talked about, but if you are really super interested in Earthblade, I would suggest going and watching that because I couldn't cover everything. I'll have a link to it in the description. If you are excited about Earthblade, definitely stick around this channel because I will be covering any news we get on the game. And if you like indie games in general, then check out some of my other videos.